In this lesson, we will talk about what a sequence is and talk about some of the vocabulary and notation that goes with sequences. A sequence is a function whose domain is the set of natural numbers or the natural numbers from 1 to any given integer, n. Each number in a sequence is called a term. Now it's important to differentiate this word, term, from the other word, term, which are things being added. Terms can be things being added, but in the case of sequences, a term is also known as any number in a sequence. Now this is a fairly complicated definition, for what we're simply talking about is a set of numbers that go in some sort of progression. Now I've written here already one sequence. It's simply a set of numbers, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, that follow some sort of progression. Now, we define a sequence as a function, and you'll recall that functions require both inputs and outputs. But it doesn't appear that in this sequence there are any inputs. It just looks like we have a whole bunch of outputs, 4, 8, 12, etc. So let's continue reading this definition to see if we can figure out what the inputs might be. Now remember that the set of numbers that we get for the inputs is the domain. Alright, so the domain of a function, or the domain of a sequence, is the set of natural numbers, which means counting numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Or we could have a set of natural numbers from 1 to any other natural number. So let's see if we can go ahead and create a chart that would allow us to create a domain and a range here. If these numbers look like our output, we could say that these would be like the range. The domain would be up here. The domain is the set of natural numbers. So that would start with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. In other words, in a sequence, all we're doing is numbering each of our terms. So the first term in this sequence is 4. The second term in the sequence is 8. The third term in the sequence is 12. Instead of writing sequences in function notation like this, we could say that f of 1 is 4, because when you plug in 1, the function gives you 4. We usually will use a different kind of notation. We'll pick a lowercase letter. Oftentimes, you'll see a or t for the name of the function. And then instead of putting the input in parentheses, we'll put it as a little subscript down below. We'd read this t sub 1. In other words, the first term in the sequence. And then we can say what that is. That equals 4. So when we talk about sequences, we don't want to use function notation like this. We generally will want to use a new kind of function or sequence notation like this. This simply means that the first term in the sequence is 4. We could continue and write another term in the sequence. The second term in this sequence is 8. The third term in the sequence is 12. And we could continue on as far as we need to go. Again, this number down below, the t sub 1, the little 1 here is called a subscript. The little 2 here is called a subscript. It's also referred to as an index as well. You might hear either the word subscript or index. Now it's important to note the significance of the domain of a sequence being the natural numbers. This means that we only have these natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we could keep going, as the inputs to the function. In many functions, we can define a function for an input of 1.5. We could put in a 1.5 between the 4 and the 8 and define that value. If we're talking about a sequence, that value is not defined. We can only talk about numbers where the input value is a whole counting number. We're just counting each individual term, the first term, the second term, the third term, etc. Now let's also get familiar with some of the other notation that we'll be seeing when we work with sequences. Most commonly, when you're working with functions, you will call the input value x, and you will call the output value f of x. You input an x, you output f of whatever that input value was. That's not the case with sequences. Usually we will call the input value of a sequence n. Now we're going to use this terminology right here, or this notation right here, to name the output value. But our output value, if we're labeling it, we don't want it to have a specific number, we want it to be general. So the output value, if it's still called t, would be t sub n, because n represents the input value. Now if you want to actually name these, you could call the input value the term number, or the number of terms, however it is that you would want to think of it. And then the output value is actually the term itself. Remember that each number in a sequence is called a term. So the terms 4, 8, 12, 16 are the actual numbers in the sequence. The input value simply counts the terms. It's the term number. This will be the first term, the second term, the third term, etc. And it's important to realize that we're going to be changing the notation here when we talk about sequences, and that helps us differentiate whether the function we're talking about is a sequence or just a general function. And if the input is n, that often indicates that we're dealing with a sequence. And if you see the notation t sub n, or any other variable sub n, that generally indicates a sequence.